Okay, so have you noticed some weird things happening in global investment lately? It's like big, powerful countries are making these super expensive bets that, on the surface, just don't make any sense. Let's dive in, because there's a fascinating story here about how the world economy is being completely rewired right under our noses.
So let's start with China. We all think of them as the world's high-tech factory, right? So why on earth are they pouring money and resources into soybean farming in Tanzania? I mean, it's a country where the soybean industry is barely off the ground. It seems kind of inefficient, doesn't it?
And then you've got Germany, the industrial powerhouse of Europe. They're betting billions on green hydrogen, this, futuristic energy source. But they're doing it thousands of miles away in Namibia, a country they have let's just say, a very complicated history with. So what's the deal? What connects these two decisions that just seem so random, so counterintuitive?
Well, here's the thing. They aren't random at all, not even a little bit. Turns out they're both perfect examples of this massive new strategy that's totally rewriting the rules of global trade. It's a strategy that puts politics right up there with profit.
And it has a name. It's called friendshoring. And this definition, it absolutely nails the core idea. You're strategically moving your most critical supply chains. We're talking food, energy, technology, away from countries that might be your rivals, and you're putting them in the hands of countries you consider friends, or at the very least, countries that are on the same page as you geopolitically. It's a deliberate redrawing of the entire global economic map.
Look, for the last few decades, the rules of the game for globalization were super simple. Find the cheapest place to build something, and then find the most efficient way to ship it. That's it. End of story. But friendshoring, it flips the whole script. The new rules are all about security, about making sure you can handle shocks like a pandemic or a war. It's about strengthening ties with your allies. Cost isn't the only king anymore. In fact, it might not even be the most important factor.
Okay, so you're probably asking, why now, right? Why this huge shift all of a sudden? Why are governments and big companies suddenly okay with paying more or being less efficient? Well, it turns out it's a direct reaction to the pretty chaotic world we're all living in.
So when you really dig into it, the research shows it all comes down to three main geopolitical drivers. First up, reducing your risk. Second, something they call de-weaponizing your supply chains. And third, and this is a big one, maintaining your influence out there on the world stage. Let's break each of those down.
All right, so driver number one is basically about survival. I mean, the last few years have taught us a really brutal lesson, haven't they? Our super lean, just-in-time supply chains, they're incredibly fragile. All it takes is one pandemic, one war, one ship getting stuck in a canal, and the whole system can just grind to a halt. So friendshoring is a pivot to what you could call a just-in-case model. You're building in some backup, some redundancy, with partners you trust so you're not left high and dry when a crisis hits.
Okay, driver number two is where things get really strategic. It's both defensive and offensive. On the one hand, you're de-weaponizing by protecting your own access to critical stuff from rivals who might try to cut you off. But on the other hand, it's also about weaponizing your own economic power. Think about it. You can use your control over supply chains as a tool, as leverage, to put pressure on your adversaries. We're talking trade sanctions, export bans. That's the playbook.
And that brings us to the third driver, influence. In today's world, with different superpowers competing for the top spot, economic partnerships are a huge diplomatic tool. When you're friendshoring, you're not just buying stuff, you're building political trust. You're actively competing for the loyalty of those non-aligned nations, hoping to turn a trade partner into a real strategic ally.
All right, so we get the why now. But let's be real. A massive economic shift like this doesn't just happen. Companies aren't going to just ditch their super efficient supply chains out of a sense of patriotism. So how do governments actually pull this off? Well, it turns out they have a playbook.
So the core idea is something researchers call pushing the network out. What that means is that governments, countries like China and Germany, don't just cross their fingers and hope their companies make the right move. No way. They get actively involved. They step in to make investing in these friendly but maybe less obvious places not just possible but actually really attractive.
And they do this using three main tactics from their playbook. First, they de-risk the investment. Basically, they make it financially safe for their companies to go in. Second, they act as a network broker. They make the intros, they build the connections. And third, they get involved in institution building overseas, essentially changing the local rules of the game so that it favors their own firms.
All right, so now we've got the toolkit, the three big drivers and the three playbook tactics. Let's take this framework and go back to our original mystery.
Let's see if it can solve the puzzle of why China is in Tanzania and Germany is in Namibia.
And here, you can really see how it all comes together. We've got two very different approaches, but they're aiming for the exact same goal. China is using this really direct, state-controlled method to lock down its soybean supply. Germany, on the other hand, is using a more indirect, what we'll call state-incentivized approach to get private companies to jump into hydrogen. Let's zoom in on each one.
So China's playbook is pretty heavy-handed, very direct. To de-risk the deal, they use a massive state-to-state purchase guarantee. They basically go to Tanzania and say, don't worry, we'll buy all the soybeans you can grow. To broker the network, they use their giant state-owned companies, their SOEs, as the main players on the ground. And to build the institutions, they get Tanzania to fast-track the approval for new, high-yield Chinese soybean seeds. It's pure top-down control. So Germany's approach is definitely more subtle. To de-risk, they use public money to bridge the gap between how much expensive green hydrogen costs and what the market is actually willing to pay for it right now. To broker the network, they create these business-to-business platforms and lead official delegations to make introductions. And for institution building, they fund a brand new Green Hydrogen Research Institute right there in Namibia, creating the local brainpower that the industry needs to actually succeed.
So here's the bottom line. You've got one state-directed push and one state-incentivized push. But the end goal? It is identical. Both countries are using the power of the state to reshape global production. They're prioritizing their geopolitical security over pure, simple market logic, all to lock down critical resources from new strategic partners.
Okay, so this isn't just some niche trend that only affects soybeans and hydrogen. This is a massive signpost pointing to a fundamental rewiring of the entire global economy. So, what are the big things you should walk away with from all this? Okay, 3 big takeaways. Number 1, geopolitics is now playing in the same league as cost when it comes to global trade decisions. It's a huge deal. Number 2, don't make the mistake of thinking this is just a Western strategy aimed at China. As you've clearly seen, China is an absolute master at playing this game too. And number 3, these new economic maps aren't just happening by accident. They are being actively, deliberately engineered by governments.
And this quote from some of the research really just hits the nail on the head. It says, the way we organize production around the world will no longer follow the simple rules of cost efficiency. Instead, it's going to follow geopolitical rules. We're literally leaving one era and entering a completely new one, where the map of production is being redrawn along the lines of political alliances.
And all of this leaves us with a huge and, honestly, pretty unsettling question. As the world starts to break up into these economic blocks of friends, with everyone building their own resilient supply chains, what happens to all the countries that are left on the outside? In a world that's being rebuilt on friendshoring, what's the fate of everyone else?